Welcome to the deep dive. Ready to explore this whole idea of chasing the feeling?
I am.
Today we're looking at how we do it through art, literature, and media.
Sounds fascinating.
You sent over some really interesting pieces from chasing the feeling art, literature, and media.
Right.
And I think there's a lot to unpack there. Essentially, it's about how we use creative works to experience specific emotions, sometimes to kind of escape reality, sometimes to better understand our own lives, you know?
Yeah, it's like we're using things that other people create, books and movies and music, even video games, to explore our own, like, inner worlds.
Exactly. And one of the first things the source digs into is escapism, that idea of taking a break from reality, getting lost in a fictional world.
Right, right.
But it goes deeper than just that. Like, it makes us think about what's really happening when we do that, when we escape.
Yeah, is it just about distraction? Or is there something more to it? The source suggests that maybe it's also about finding emotions or experiences that we feel are missing in our everyday lives. So it's not just about escaping what is, but also about fulfilling, like, a need.
Makes sense. They use the example of someone feeling totally stressed out, overwhelmed, so they pick up a fantasy novel, get to be a powerful hero for a while. It's more than just forgetting their problems. It's about feeling a sense of control, which they might not have in their real life at that moment.
And what's interesting is how different ways of escaping, cater to different emotional needs, like video games. You actually get to be a part of the story, make choices, see the consequences of your actions. That can be really powerful, especially if you feel like you don't have much control in other areas of your life.
Oh, you know what? That reminds me of something I read about how different types of video games, they attract people with certain personalities or emotional needs. Someone who loves strategy games, maybe they're looking for that sense of control and mastery, right? And someone who's into RPGs might be all about adventure and exploring. It's like we're all drawn to the type of escapism that fits our own desires.
Yeah, I get that. It shows just how complex escapism really is. It's not just zoning out, it's a way of connecting with our feelings. The source does point out, though, that we need to be careful about relying too much on it.
Right, right. Like anything else, too much of a good thing and all that. If we're always escaping, are we avoiding what's going on in our real lives? But then again, couldn't you say it's also a healthy way to cope? De-stress, recharge, so we can deal with reality better?
That's the big question, isn't it? The source wants us to think about our own relationship with escapism. What are we looking for when we escape? What needs are we trying to meet? And are we finding a balance between that and, the stuff we have to do in our actual lives? Something to ponder as we go on.
Okay, so switching gears a bit, let's talk about symbolism. The source says it's about using imagery or objects, especially in art, to stand for bigger concepts, ideas. And they get into semiotics, which is studying signs and symbols and how we make sense of them.
Symbols are fascinating, right? Because they work on this really deep level, often without us realizing it. They tap into those things we all experience as humans, and they make abstract feelings like love or freedom or power feel more real. The source mentions how a luxury car, for example, is often used to symbolize success and status.
Yeah, we just get it. That image of a fancy car speeding down the road, it makes you think of freedom, of achieving something, even if you don't drive a car like that. But isn't that kind of, I don't know, obvious? Do we really fall for those advertising tricks?
We might, because that's how powerful symbols are. They bypass our logical thinking and get straight to those deep desires and dreams we have. Even if you know it's manipulation, it can still affect you emotionally.
I see what you mean. The source also talks about how symbols, like a sunset, are used in movies to bring out specific emotions. Like a sunset can mean the end of something, a sense of closure, or a new beginning.
Right, exactly. And because we've all seen sunsets, it works for everyone. It resonates. Think of those classic movie scenes, where the character's looking out at a sunset. It's a way to show a complex feeling without having to say it.
And isn't it interesting how symbols can also be used to, create mystery? Like in a painting, there might be one object, maybe a wilted flower, that really stands out and makes you wonder, what does that flower represent? What's the story there?
You got it. Symbols can be so powerful because they make the viewer think, they make you participate in finding the meaning. You're not just watching, you're engaging, bringing your own experiences to it.
It's like art gives us a way to express those feelings we don't have words for. Speaking of stories, that leads us to another big idea from the source: narrative identity.
This is where things get interesting. The source is saying that the stories we tell ourselves about our own lives, they actually shape who we think we are. It's not just the things that happen, but how we see those things, the meaning we give them, and the story we create out of them.
Almost like we're all the stars of our own movies, constantly editing the script to fit the story we want to believe. The source gives the example of someone going through a tough breakup. Instead of seeing it as a failure, they choose to think of it as a step on their journey of finding themselves. It's not about pretending it didn't hurt. It's about choosing to focus on the growth that came from that experience.
And what's really interesting is that those personal narratives often use cultural narratives, like societal expectations. The source mentions the American dream, for example, and how it's like a template for how we define success, how we define happiness. It can have a big impact on the stories we tell ourselves, even if we don't realize it.
So it's not just our own choices, it's also about the bigger picture, the culture that influences how we see ourselves and what we're aiming for.
Exactly. And that brings up some important questions. Are we chasing feelings that really matter to us, or are we just following a script that society gave us? How can we become aware of those influences so we can make real choices about the stories we create for ourselves?
Those are some deep questions. And it makes me wonder, how much control do we actually have over our own stories? I mean, memories can be tricky, and our perceptions can be influenced by so many things.
Yeah, you're right. It's complicated. And the source does talk about some of the psychology involved. Things like self-narrative, which is basically the story we're always telling ourselves about who we are, and cognitive biases, which are those ways our brains can distort information to fit what we already believe.
So it's like there's this back and forth between our conscious efforts to shape our narratives and those unconscious processes that can mess with our perceptions.
Exactly. That push and pull is what makes narrative identity so fascinating. It's this constant interplay between choice and influence, between the stories we want to tell and the stories that are kind of imposed on us.
This is where it gets really interesting. We'll dive even deeper after a quick break.
Welcome back. We were just getting into how our lives are kind of like these narratives, we're shaping them to highlight certain feelings.
It makes you wonder how much power we have in shaping our own experiences. Like, even if we don't always realize we're doing it.
Exactly. The source really emphasizes that, saying by changing how we see our narratives, we can actually change our emotions. You don't always need your circumstances to change to feel like pride or joy or peace, right? It's more about the meaning we find in the stories we tell ourselves.
It reminds me of this time I completely bombed a presentation at work. I was mortified, wanted to disappear. But instead of just letting that feeling of failure take over, I tried to focus on what I could learn from it, kind of reframed it in my mind, turned it into a lesson on public speaking and resilience, actually helped me feel more confident for next time.
That's a perfect example. You took control of the narrative, turned a negative thing into something positive, something that helped you grow. That's exactly what the source is getting at, finding that empowering thread,
Right. But the source also warns us about getting too lost in our stories.
Yeah.
It's easy to get so caught up in crafting the perfect narrative that you lose touch with what's real.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Like getting so attached to a book character that you forget you're reading a book. And sometimes we cling to stories that don't serve us anymore just because they're familiar.
So how do we find that balance then between shaping our narratives and, staying grounded?
I think it comes down to being honest with ourselves, looking at the stories we tell ourselves and asking, are these helping me? Are they pushing me forward or holding me back? That kind of thing.
The source also brings up this idea about art blurring the lines between what's real and what's imagined. They say the feelings we get from art, they're just as valid as those from real-life experiences.
It's like it validates those who find comfort and fulfillment through creative stuff, It's saying that chasing feelings through art, through books, movies, music, it's not just a silly thing. It's a way to connect with ourselves emotionally.
Yeah. It makes me think about how much this one movie affected me. It was about a family dealing with loss, and even though I have gone through that myself, the way they portrayed grief in the film, it hit me hard.
That's because art can tap into these universal human experiences. Even if you haven't lived through the exact same thing, you can still relate to the emotions. And often art lets us explore those emotions safely without the real life consequences.
It's like we're allowed to feel those feelings fully, even the tough ones.
Exactly. And I think that's a big part of this whole chasing the feeling thing. It's not just about looking for happy feelings like joy or excitement. It's about being open to the whole spectrum of human emotion, the good, the bad, all of it.
You're right. Recognizing that all those emotions, even the hard ones, they're part of what makes us human. And sometimes those hard ones, they can be the ones that change us the most if we let ourselves feel them.
Yeah, totally. The source also talks about how art and stories can make us more empathetic, more connected to each other. When we see ourselves in a character's struggles, or we're moved by a piece of music that speaks to, like, a universal feeling, we don't feel so alone.
I think about music a lot with that. How sometimes a song can just nail a feeling that you can't even put into words yourself, like it perfectly captures heartbreak or longing or joy in a way that goes beyond language. And when you listen to that song, it's like you're sharing that feeling with the artist, with everyone who's ever felt that way.
It's almost like art creates this language of emotion that we can all understand, even if our lives are completely different. And that connection, it can be so powerful, especially when the world feels so divided.
It's like we're all connected by these shared emotions, and art is the thread that ties us all together.
That's a beautiful way to put it. But the source reminds us, as powerful as it is to lose ourselves in art and escapism, we also got to take action in our real lives.
Right, like it's one thing to be inspired by a movie about overcoming challenges. It's another thing to actually do something to make changes in our own lives.
Totally. It's about that balance, between the internal and the external, the imagined and the real.
So how can we make sure we're using these things, escapism and symbolism, to help us grow instead of just getting stuck in them or disconnected from reality?
The source says, look at the art and media you're taking in. What feelings are they giving you? What values or beliefs are they showing? And how can you take those insights and do something with them in your own life?
So it's about using art and media as a starting point for self-reflection and growth, not as a replacement for actually living.
Exactly. We can get strength and inspiration from stories and symbols, but we got to take those things and apply them to our relationships, our work, our communities.
I think that's an important takeaway for our listeners. Art and media can be incredibly powerful, but in the end, it's up to us to decide how to use them to build a more fulfilling life.
I agree. And with that, I think it's time to move on to our final thoughts on how we can all become more mindful, more intentional about how we chase the feeling in our everyday lives.
We've been through a lot in this deep dive, escaping into those fantasy worlds, figuring out the hidden language of symbolism, how we shape our own life stories. It's a lot.
Yeah, for sure.
It's amazing how much our emotions are tied to the art, literature, media, all of that. As we wrap up exploring chasing the feeling, what really stands out to you?
I think one of the biggest takeaways for me is fulfillment doesn't have to just come from our external reality.
Right.
The source makes a point of saying that emotions we experience through art, they're just as real, just as valid as those we get from real life experiences.
It's freeing, isn't it?
It is. It makes it okay to find joy and inspiration, even sadness, from creative works.
Right.
Whether you're lost in a good book, connecting with a painting, or even just changing how you see a personal experience, those are all ways to find fulfillment.
Like this source is giving us permission to seek out those moments, those experiences, the ones that make us feel alive. Doesn't matter if it comes from the real world or from our imaginations.
Exactly. And I think it's also pushing us to be more aware of what we choose to watch, read, listen to, to pay attention to how it makes us feel, why certain stories grab us, what those choices say about us.
Be more conscious about it, not just passively taking it in.
Right. It's realizing that we have a say in how we feel in our emotional world by choosing the stories and symbols that we surround ourselves with.
Okay.
We can choose things that uplift us, challenge how we think, inspire us to grow.
So as we end our deep dive, the source leaves us with this challenge. It's not just about chasing fleeting happiness or escape, but using art, literature, and media as tools to discover ourselves, to grow.
It's a call to really pay attention to the art and media around us, to let it affect us, challenge us, and inspire us.
And to think about what those experiences tell us about our own journey of chasing the feeling. What are we searching for? What stories do we want to tell? And how do we want to feel?
I think this deep dive has given us a good way to approach those questions. And it's helped us understand how much art and media can really add to our lives emotionally.
It really has. Thank you all for joining us on this journey. Hopefully you've learned some new things and maybe you rediscover the power of art, literature, and media, how they help us connect with ourselves and the world.
Until next time, keep searching, keep asking those questions, and keep chasing the feelings that make life worth living.